Hi everyone, and welcome to the Validity and Reliability in Research Designs lecture video. There are two important vocabulary terms that you're going to learn in this video, and that's reliability and validity. These words have a variety of different meanings depending on the discipline, so it's important that you understand how they're used in criminal justice research methods specifically. In research methods, reliability means the ability to complete the same research study over again and get the same conclusions. Reliability of a study can be affected by measurement decisions. If a question is reliable, then the researcher can ask the same question over and over and get the same answer every time. An unreliable question is one where the researcher will get a different response every time they ask. Reliability can also be affected by the clarity of protocol. If you're analyzing a movie for violence, you want to make sure you're very clear on what constitutes violence. If an actor kicks someone, does that count as violence? If a gun is being shown, is that violence? What about a photograph of a gun shown in the background? Still count as violence? We're going to explore this more in depth as we go through the research design modules, but it's important to make sure that you're as clear as possible about what you did to complete the study so it can be replicated with the same results. Validity is another important concept. Validity is the extent to which your empirical measure adequately represents the concept. There are several different subtypes of validity, with the main distinction between external validity and internal validity. External validity is sample-driven. External validity is whether or not you can generalize findings from your research to larger populations and is highly impacted by your sampling decisions. When you have a large representative sample, then you have high external validity. Smaller samples or less representative samples create external validity concerns. Now, internal validity has a lot of jargon-filled definitions, but one of my favorite sayings is that a former professor of mine used to say is, are we measuring what we think we are measuring? Whether or not we are can be influenced by our measurement decisions as well as our research designs. If I ask people about committing burglaries, do my measurements and my questions actually tap into that concept of committing burglary? If so, then when I analyze my results and make conclusions, I will be making accurate statements. If I'm actually measuring something different, then my conclusions will be biased and may not be replicable. In experiments, I'm usually trying to narrow down a cause and effect relationship between two variables by holding other variables constant. If I do not manage to do that, then I can introduce potential sources of error into my study, which would lower my internal validity. The choice of experimental design can influence both internal. The ways in which validity is affected by the research design are called threats to validity. There are numerous threats to validity out there, but for the purposes of this course, I'm going to show you a few select ones. For each threat to validity, you need to understand what the threat means, what research designs create the threat, and what research design decisions can eliminate or at least reduce the threat. I've organized all of these threats into the acronym Dr. Smith. So let's start with D. D stands for demoralization and diffusion. Diffusion means that some of the treatment gets diffused down to the control group. Think about this example. I give all the students in a classroom a survey about prejudice. Then I take half the students into a different room and show them a video about inclusivity and diversity. I then put the group back together and have them take the same survey again. What's the problem? The main issue here is that both groups of kids are immediately going back into the same room. So it's pretty much expected that the movie watchers will talk to the non-movie watchers. So the control group will end up getting a little bit of the treatment, even if they weren't supposed to. Any study that has an experimental and a control group, and these groups have contact with one another during the experiment, will face the threat of diffusion. To protect against diffusion, you can either not use a control group, which isn't a great design choice, or you can separate your groups out so they cannot interact until the experiment is done. So maybe instead of all the students in a single classroom participating, we take classroom A and make it the experimental group, and then classroom B becomes the control group. Then all we need to do is make sure classroom A and B stay apart during the experiment, and we've eliminated the threat. Demoralization works in a similar manner, as it requires interaction between the experimental groups and the control groups. But demoralization is about the control group getting frustrated or upset and then giving up. If all those movie watching kids from the first classroom got a cookie while the control group got nothing, it may upset the control group children and make them less likely to respond honestly to the post-test survey. Like diffusion, keeping the two groups apart can eliminate this threat. You could also provide a placebo incentive to the control group, like they do in medical studies. So it looks like the control group and the experimental group are getting the same reward, but in reality, one of them's a real reward and one of them's this like fake look-alike that won't have the same effect. The R in Dr. Smith stands for reactivity effect. The reactivity effect occurs when the novelty of engaging in research or causes the subject to react differently because they're in an experimental situation. This is also referred to as the Hawthorne effect. Here's a short video about this effect.
The Hawthorne effect is the tendency we have to perform better when we know somebody is studying us. For example, a 2015 study of hospital staff hand washing found that staff were almost 3 times more likely to wash their hands when they knew they were being studied. The term Hawthorne effect comes from an experiment conducted at a US factory run by General Electric in Hawthorne near Chicago during the 1920s into factors that affected productivity. Everything worked. Increasing the illumination of the factory boosted productivity. Dimming the lights boosted productivity. Introducing rest pauses also worked. So did small group incentives. Oddly, after a positive change, returning to previous work conditions was also met with positive results. One popular interpretation of these results is that the novelty of being observed leads humans to perform tasks better. When we feel we're being studied, we improve our behaviour. While the experiment has been described as a glorified anecdote and it certainly falls well short of modern social science, it gives rise to this famous Hawthorne effect. Modern studies have confirmed the presence of this effect in a range of scenarios. For example, when teachers are observed in classrooms, they can exhibit better teaching behaviours than when left to their own devices. In my own work, I've had participants literally say, "I was going to do A, but I knew you were coming in, so I did B." While this can be a cause of frustration for researchers, it has implications for teachers. When students know they're being studied and valued, their performance improves. It also means that professional practice projects in schools, whatever they may be, will usually result in improved teaching outcomes. So, get into teams, observe each other, it'll almost certainly work. When humans know they're being studied, their performance usually improves. That is the Hawthorne effect.
One of the best ways to reduce a reactivity concern is to use a natural experiment or to include experimental and control groups that do not have a pretest in your design, as this will limit the number of observations that are conducted on some of the groups. That brings us to S. S stands for selection bias. Selection bias can occur in two ways. If there is a difference between those who volunteer for the research study and those who do not, then the sample does not look like the population. This creates selection bias, which then threatens generalizability, reducing our external validity. Almost every study that uses surveys or interviews has selection bias, because inherently, whoever agrees to be part of the study is going to be different than those who disagree. Unless we eliminate voluntary participation, which is problematic ethically, then we risk selection bias in these type of research studies. Another way that selection bias can occur is when there is a difference between the control and the experimental group. Substantial differences in measured characteristics between the two groups will make comparisons between them invalid, influencing our internal validity. The fix for this type of selection bias is to use random assignment or matching strategy to achieve equality and representation between the experimental and the control group. On to M, which stands for maturation and mortality. These issues are only relevant for longitudinal research studies, since they only occur when there is at least 2 time points the data is gathered at. Maturation is about the changing of our personalities, behaviors, and opinions over time as a result of the natural maturation process. If I were to gather data from this man at each point in time, his answers would be different. This doesn't matter what my independent variable is, it's just a normal part of life. The only way to eliminate maturation altogether is to use a cross-sectional design. You can also reduce maturation by decreasing the amount of time between time 1 and time 2 in a longitudinal study. That reduces the risk that your subject will mature enough to create distinct changes during the experiment. Mortality, as expected, is about subjects that drop out of the subject study for one reason or another. They may die, they may opt out, or the researcher may not be able to find them again. Remember, I called the same issue attrition before, and it means the same thing. The problem is that if people drop out, then I won't be able to make conclusions with the same data because I will collect less at each subsequent time point. Once again, the fix here is to use cross-sectional designs or to reduce the time between data collections so as to reduce the opportunity for mortality. Another option that is available if you cannot reduce the time period is to obtain a larger sample size than you need and randomly assign the experimental and control group. That way you have a participant buffer that allows for some mortality to occur, and the random assignment assures that this mortality is equally likely to occur in both groups. Instrumentation is one of the few threats to validity that the researcher has complete control over. Instrumentation occurs when the measurement method used in the pretest does not match the measurement method used in the post-test, making the comparison between the two invalid. Instrumentation does not exist in a cross-sectional design because you don't have a pretest there. However, it's also really simple to control for instrumentation in a longitudinal design. Just make sure to keep the instrument the same both times. In criminal justice, one of the most well-known issues of instrumentation is the changing definition of rape in the Uniform Crime Report's data collection. The original definition was the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. Now, obviously, this definition is gendered, so it only applies to female victims, and it requires both penis and vagina contact, force on behalf of the penetrator, and resistance on behalf of the victim. In 2013, the UCR definition was changed to a new definition that's shown here. Penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. This new definition specifically avoided gender terminology so as to apply to both male and female victims, and the acts of penetration were expanded to include penetration of any body part by either a sex organ or an object without consent. As you can see, the force and resistance stipulations are then removed so long as consent is not given. When you look at the UCR data, the FBI segregates data from 2013 beyond from the data gathered previously because it is acknowledged that the definitional changes create major changes in the reporting. For instance, the 2012 rate of rape in the United States was calculated at 27.1 instances of rape per every 100,000 people. The 2013 rate of rape rose substantially to 35.9 instances of rape per 100,000 people. The UCR labels each rate as belonging to the legacy definition, meaning the original, or the revised definition. Researchers who use rape statistics from the UCR have to avoid making direct comparisons across time periods because of this change in definition. Getting there, close to there, I promise. We're all the way down to T in Smith. T stands for testing effect. Testing effect occurs when a subject learns the test and changes their answers on the post-test accordingly. This may be purposeful. For instance, if I was to give everyone a survey about recycling and then have them watch a video about the advantages of recycling, the subjects will clearly understand I'm trying to influence their recycling behaviors. So they may be more inclined to lie on the post-test and report a more positive view of recycling than they actually feel because they understand what the point of the test is. However, the testing effect can also occur unconsciously. For example, the College Board reports that the best way to earn a high score on the SAT is to take a practice test. Why? Because you learn the test. Taking the test multiple times makes you feel more comfortable with the process and the format of the test itself, making it more likely that you'll earn a higher score. Research suggests that 2 out of 3 people will see an increase in their SAT scores when they take the test again, even if they take the second test right away. Now, I'm not saying that the testing effect will make you a genius on the SAT, but it may provide a small increase in your score. The only way to eliminate the testing effect altogether is to use a cross-sectional design, as this eliminates the pretest and the subject's ability to learn the test. But then, of course, you introduce more error into the process. So, like the Hawthorne effect, the best way to reduce a testing effect concern in a longitudinal design is to use either a natural experiment or to include experimental and control groups without a pretest in your design. All right, almost made it. We're on the H in Dr. Smith, which stands for history. Now, history is a really confusing term, and frankly, if I were able to rename it, I would. Because when we think of history, we think of things that have happened in the past. But in research methods, the history threat to validity is about things that happen during the experiment that are outside of the researcher's control. This is the example I use every year because it highlights the history effect more than anything else. Let's say you conduct a survey with college students asking about their views towards immigration on September 10th, 2001. You then have all the students watch a movie that highlights the various ways that immigrants have contributed to scientific breakthroughs and economic victories in the United States. 2 days later, you have the subjects come back and take the same test again. What's the problem? September 11th, right? The World Trade Center attack occurred right in the middle of your hypothetical study. And as you can imagine, this attack had a substantial impact on people's attitudes towards immigration, among other issues. So your movie is likely to be completely irrelevant here. But how can you know that for sure? The best way to control for history is to add a control group. Even college students who didn't watch your film on immigration are going to show a change in the pretest to post-test values. This is your clue that something is going on outside of your independent variable that you need to account for. All right, well, that concludes the lecture on validity and reliability in research design. I know that's a lot, so again, remember you can always rewatch these videos if you need to refresh your memory. I also have some additional videos about threats to validity available on my website. Thanks for watching, everyone.